This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Reaching back into the archives, as I like to do, especially in the summer of 2022, two professors today, two very insightful professors, both in the psych headspace, we can say. First, William Damon from Stanford. Second, Roy Baumeister from Florida State, my alma mater, at least my alma mater for grad school. Without any further delay, let's jump right into William Damon and Roy Baumeister. My guest today is William Damon. He is a professor of education at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, director of the Stanford Center on Adolescence, and a senior fellow at the Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He's one of the world's leading researchers on the development of purpose in life and the author of the widely influential book, The Path to Purpose. Also, and this is really cool, in January 2018, Bill was named one of the 50 most influential psychologists in the world. Quite an honor. And for me, I'm honored that as a political science major with not great grades at all, who has put together some pretty cool investing books, but I feel honored and fortunate that I get to continue to learn every time I do this podcast and I get a chance to talk to brilliant men like William Damon. Think about it. Put yourself in my shoes. I just told you my academic chops. There's nothing to write home about. Absolutely nothing to write home about. I dialed it in. I got through an undergraduate, and I got through an MBA. Key phrase, got through. Now, if I can figure out a way to find a purpose, and I got to tell you, this conversation with Bill forces anyone, including myself, absolutely 100%, forces me to rethink about the purpose, to carve that purpose a little cleaner on the edges. It forces that internal inventory, the internal inventory that we should all be doing every damn day. Because look, you can have all the money in the world. And don't get me wrong, I'm a capitalist. I'd like to have all the money in the world, but it's probably not going to happen like that. You can have all the money in the world. You can have all the fame in the world. I guess in one little narrow slice of the world, I have some fame amongst older guys that like trading books. Why couldn't I get something cool for fame where like women between 25 and 35 are even more interested in me? That's the cool kind of fame, right? The classic Mick Jagger, Robert Plant fame. But I guess I will take my slice at fame right now because that little slice at fame gives me the chance. And let's bring it back to the most important aspect of what you're about to hear. That brings me back to William Damon and purpose. And if this conversation doesn't force you to think about your purpose on this planet right away, go see a doctor or something. Go get a checkup. Something's wrong with you. I hope you enjoy this conversation with William Damon. You know, Bill, I'm sitting here today preparing for this conversation, and I'm thinking to myself, where was Bill when I was in high school? Where was Bill when I was in college? Why did I not have this purpose perspective? Because as a man in my late 40s, I can look at your world and you just have those aha moments where there's a simplicity of what appears to be a common sense idea. There's a lot of data behind it, I know. But what is your purpose? What is our purpose? And my gosh, we just don't think about this, do we?
People are beginning to think about it now, but you're right. It's been off the radar screen for too long. When people think about it, they have pretty much the same reaction that you do. That's part of the reason I think the idea has really caught on a lot. It's kind of amazing. I mean, we've been doing work on it now for about 10 years or so, and everything's changed. Now the word's all over the place, and we get zillions of phone calls and hear stories. There's research being done. I think there was a need for attention to this idea for sure.
Let me take you back in time, though. You mentioned 10 years, but your career obviously goes back farther than that. And I'm sure you were probably thinking about these issues early on before maybe it got codified into specific research directions. But start to lay the foundation, because this is not just something where you sat back and said, hey, I've got a great idea, and then just wrote some books. I mean, there's a lot of research here. And so you've got into the nitty gritty of gathering data, the surveying, the looking at individuals and how they act within families, et cetera. Why don't you speak to perhaps your triggers, your early triggers, even in the field of developmental psychology? Give me some feel for your start and what fascinated you to go this direction.
There were outside influences, and there was the direction of my own work. One of the great outside influences was the Viennese psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who wrote a very powerful book translated into English as Man's Search for Meaning. The original German title was actually Nevertheless Say Yes to Life. Frankl was really the world's first positive psychologist, I think. He wrote in the mid to late-ish 20th century. His great personal story was that he was thrown into a concentration camp during World War II and survived the experience by clinging on to his purpose of writing a manuscript, proposing a whole new approach to psychotherapy that he called logotherapy, which means meaning therapy. His basic idea was we're not determined by our past traumas or whatever our parents did to us when we were young, or really any of the experiences that we've had in the past. Rather, we have control over our own fate by looking to the future and by developing purpose, developing something to live for, something to believe in. And he wrote that book, which a lot of people read, but it never had much of an effect on the field of psychology for quite a while, even though a lot of people found it inspiring. At the same time, in my own development, I was doing a lot of work on commitment of people to their work. For example, we, with some collaborators, Howard Gardner and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, we did a big project called Good Work, which was about how workers in any field, doctors, lawyers, journalists, businessmen and women, educators, teachers, manual laborers, how people could become committed to the highest standards of their field, both excellence in terms of really doing a great job and ethics, doing the right thing. What I found, each of us, the three of us, had our own insights about the work, as any three psychologists would, but my take on it was that what all of the good workers had in all of these fields was a really clear sense of the mission of their field, of what the field was about and what the public service was that the field was dedicated to. And the mission is not hard to state. Doctors, of course, are dedicated to healing people. Lawyers are dedicated to getting justice done for their clients. Business people, hopefully, are dedicated to producing services or goods that the world needs. But all of the people that we identified as good workers, really that mission was front and center, and they were very articulate about how their work served that mission. I thought about this for a while, and I thought mission is an idea that has to do with a field. Medicine has the mission of healing people and so on. But what is the equivalent for individuals, for people living their lives in a psychological sense? And then I got back to thinking about Frankl's work and his great book, And I thought, well, this is purpose. Purpose is really the idea that drives individuals towards a good life, towards a successful life, towards a life worth living, a life of meaning, a life that's dedicated to something beyond the day-to-day survival and all of the self-protection and self-promotion that sometimes we get just totally obsessed with. But people that think beyond that, to the future, to the far horizons, to goals that they really throw themselves into, those are the people that are satisfied, that have a fulfilled life. And that concept, that master concept that gets you there, that gets you to understand that, is purpose. So that's how I got onto this. And we've been doing work with people at really all ages. How do you help young people develop purpose? How can schools help promote purpose in students? And then as you get on in life, how can folks at an older age keep their purposes going, get purposes, find new purposes as they retire from their jobs or as their children move on and no longer need day-to-day attention? How can you then fill your life with a new purpose? We and other people have found that folks that have purpose are energetic, they're resilient, they tend to be highly motivated, and as I said, not so obsessed with themselves, but rather life and all of life's possibilities. Even gerontology has discovered the importance of purpose. As I understand it, gerontologists are believing now that purpose deters morbidity and mortality even. People tend to be more vital longer in life if they have purpose late in life.
It is a fascinating topic because it's a topic, as I said from the very top, we're not having this dialogue on such a wide scale yet. I mean, we can find many books on Amazon, yours, of course, and many others. You mentioned Carol Dweck, and there's a lot of great writing out there, and a lot of people are consuming, and a lot of people are understanding these directions. But if we just blur our eyes and we look at, for example, something silly, it's not really silly, I guess, these days, it's pretty prevalent. The selfie, the use of social media, the short-term thinking. It seems like all of our cultural touchstones today, the things that we use the most, the things that we consume the most, the social media, the news, the media, etc., it's all about the moment. And there doesn't seem to be, for especially young people, and I know that's one of your focuses, and we'll start to unpack this, but for younger people today, they're being bombarded with social media and apps, etc. Growing up as a 15-year-old today is quite different than perhaps, of course, a 15-year-old in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I mean, they are facing a level of information flow, a short-term information flow that's unheard of, unimagined decades ago.
Well, I think you're right, and I think we don't really understand yet what the consequences of that are going to be. I can tell you that there still are lots and lots of young people who are very well directed. They do find reasons to dedicate themselves to important things. It's not as if the world has changed so much that it's impossible for a young person to grow up on the right track. But I think you're right. There are a lot of distractions. It could be that at any time in history there were always distractions. We don't really know because we can't go back 100 years or 200 years and really look around and interview young people then and see what they were thinking. But for sure, you have a point that's important, which is that in today's world, there are lots of short-term distractions and also inducements to worry about the wrong things. A lot of young people worry too much about getting into prestigious colleges, for example. That's something that is a great source of stress for a lot of young folks that we see.
Bill, isn't that important? I mean, I'm talking to a professor at one of the finest universities in the world. You, being at Stanford, isn't that important, though? Aren't the prestigious universities, if you get in, doesn't that set you up for life, so to speak?
Well, I'm going to say something to surprise you, I think. For sure, a good education is important. There's no question about that. And I will say that a Stanford education is a good education, so I'm proud of my own institution. But I will also say that a good education is available at lots and lots of places, including community colleges and state colleges. What's much more important than getting into a prestigious college is getting into a college that's a good match for your interests, for your comfort zone, for the kind of career and vocational interests that you have. And that is not by any means the colleges that rank high on all of the ratings for every young person. I advise young people to not worry so much about status and prestige, because we see that the young people who are going to local colleges or community colleges that are working hard and doing a good job end up a lot better than some of the students who are going to the higher rank colleges but don't take it seriously or don't really invest themselves in it or aren't a good match for the place. That's just another example of what you were actually talking about, which is people who are getting distracted by the wrong goals. Status, prestige, these are not the kind of goals that are fulfilling in life or that will give you a good education.
See, when you say that, though, when you say status and prestige are not fulfilling, and what you're really saying is kind of over the long run, maybe it feels good in the moment. I mean, if you're 30 years old and you make $1 million off of cryptocurrency, you're now pretty much at kind of God level if you didn't have that money. I mean, for that moment, you're feeling pretty good, and you're near Silicon Valley, so you've seen many personalities go from 0 to 60. But you're making a longer term case. Why don't you expand on that a little bit? Because you've already talked about kind of like what happens in older age, and there's a physiological element here that if you have that purpose, but just having all the money in the bank or being on the magazine cover, it looks good in the moment, but it's not necessarily it's not gonna carry you, is it?
Well, there's even pretty good data on it that amount of money or amount of celebrity does not produce happiness. And I'm not taking a anti-materialistic position totally. I think it's fine for people to have aspirations and ambitions, and certainly you want to earn enough to support yourself and your family. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying nice things in life either. So I'm not trying to be a prude about this, but I can tell you that if that's all you have is aspirations to acquire more and more and more glitzy things, that is not likely to lead you to long-term authentic happiness. And there are so many cases of this and case studies and observations of people that are just miserable because they haven't found something more fulfilling in life and something beyond themselves. And that's really the main point about purpose, is that you need to do something that's dedicated to something larger than yourself in life. Otherwise, you will never have enough. You will never have enough to satisfy your materialistic impulses, ever. You'll always be grasping for more and more and more, and you'll always come up short. And you'll do a lot of worrying about yourself. And if you're dedicated to something more important, bigger, something that has to do with other people's benefits, your family, your customers, the world, that gives you something to really be proud of if you accomplish that.
Let me take this to an early stage for young people. I can still think back to my high school days. I have certain memories that feel like they were yesterday. Maybe that's not necessarily true how they unfolded, but it feels like that sometimes. But let's talk about high school, because, and we can use America as a jumping off point. What I would love for you to kind of elaborate on is the current state of the high school experience from your perspective. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? I mean, to me, it seems like the high school experience, I'm not so sure it's changed since I got out in the 80s, but it seems like it's all about, hey, memorize this, and then we just mentioned, then you will get into XYZ school, and then you will get XYZ job, and they never really tell you what happens after the XYZ job. Maybe there's XYZ family, but the purpose part, why don't you speak to the high school experience right now and where we are in terms of bringing young people into the idea of purpose at that age?
The first thing I have to say is that you can't overgeneralize, because there are a lot of different types of high schools out there. And there is a significant movement, at least in the United States, that has produced a lot of charter schools or charter school networks or kind of semi-independent schools that are available not only to young people with significant means, but now are available to all young people. In other words, they're not charging a lot of tuition and things like that. And a lot of these charter school networks, I'll mention just a couple, KIP and Summit, they're actually doing a great job at providing a curriculum that has meaning for young people, high standards, and they even are aware of purpose and other character strengths that they pay attention to. There is a movement now that is enlightened at the high school level. Unfortunately, that movement has not transformed the entire landscape of especially public schools. One of the obstacles has been big government policies that have overemphasized standardized tests and the kinds of curricula that have no personal meaning to the students. The students don't even know why they're taking some of the courses, other than, and you mentioned this, other than just to get the grades in order to get the degree, in order to get into college. But they're not even sure why they are going to college, because they haven't learned the excitement of being curious and finding out new things, and even the importance of the skills for the jobs they want to get someday. Because people aren't teaching them this; they're just teaching the curriculum in a very narrow way. And so, for a lot of high schools in our country that have been, I think, dragged into this public agenda of increasing test scores, I think that it's been a kind of a barren, empty experience for a lot of students, who then drift off and become unmotivated and never really learn very much. But as I say, there's reason to hope. Has been, even in the last 3, 4, 5 years, a reaction against the policies that have created the deadly atmosphere in a lot of schools, and there have been a lot of new approaches that are exciting teachers, and I think getting students more motivated. So it's a changing picture. It's a picture that I think there is some fresh thinking, and there is reason to hope. But as you said, there's also a lot of reason to regret that a lot of students have been wasting their time during these precious educational years.
I want to get into some examples where you can paint a picture for some of those fresh approaches where the audience that perhaps maybe have not yet seen your books can wrap their arms around something different, perhaps than their experience or perhaps than their kids went through. I want to go to there in a moment. But first, I'm something curious I'm thinking about here. You see you've done so much work, you've studied so many people, you've seen so many young people. You see young people with purpose, you see young people without purpose, and there's all shades of gray in there. When you see that young person with purpose, can you always trace back to how that purpose developed? Was it family? Was it friends? Is there always a trigger, or is there some element that it looks like there's something innate in some kids that they just kind of wake up with the purpose? Or is it always a starting point where there's been a positive influence along the way, something that triggered them?
It's more that. There are some patterns that most of the young people we've seen who are purposeful have gone through, and they go through it in their own individual way, though, and I think that may be the part that maybe that's what you are referring to when you're saying, well, is there something innate? Because no two young people do it in exactly the same way, but there are common patterns. And for example, the young people we see who have found purpose usually have observed somebody in their life, some respected or admired person who is a model of purposefulness. And it could be the parent, it could be a teacher, it could be somebody who the young person has worked for in an internship, it could be a media person, somebody who the young person has read about or has seen on television. But there is somebody out there that the young person says, this is the kind of life that I'd like to have. And it's not that the young person will do the same thing. I'll give you one quick example, just because it strikes in my memory so much because it was such an unusual context. It was a young high school student who had a summer job working in a fast food restaurant, which is a very improbable place to find purpose. But he had a manager who noticed that this young boy didn't have a great attitude about his job, and so the manager said, I want you to go outside where the customers are and really look at them and get a sense of who they are. And the boy did it. And then the manager said, these are people who work hard. They come in with their families. This may be the high point of their day. Some of them have really hard lives. And your job is not just to flip hamburgers and put onions on the buns. It's to put a smile on those people's faces because they deserve that. That's the kind of life that they've had, that they really need that break. And that boy said he came away from that job just with a totally changed attitude about working. Now, he was not going to go into the fast food business. He wasn't going to be a restaurateur, but he applied that message, the idea that you dedicate yourself to your work, you serve other people, you take satisfaction in that, you can really make a difference. What you do matters to other people. And he applied that to his own life. Observing and having a mentor or observing a model of purposefulness is a very powerful inducer of purpose for young people. And then there are a number of other things to the pattern, too. Finding out, for example, what your particular gifts are. And maybe that is partly a little bit of the innate quality you mentioned. If your purpose is to become, let's say, a musician or something, or a singer, you would not necessarily want to make that into your vocation if you were tone deaf, let's say, if you just didn't have that ability. So you need to reflect on what your abilities are, what your interests are, what you get excited about, and what you believe in, what difference you'd like to make in the world, what your contribution could be to make the world a better place. And so when all of these things come together, observing a purposeful model, getting to know yourself, thinking about the world and what the world needs, that's when finally a young person can move forward and commit to a purpose. This can take a long time. Purpose is one of the later developing capacities that we find in youth. Usually by age 20, everything has improved rapidly. But for most of the young people we see, they're just in the beginning of their journey towards purpose at that age.
And when we're speaking about young people, support is often critical. I would like for you to go in this direction with parenting, is that you can probably have many instances of very caring parents. They want to see their kids do the right thing, but almost every action of the parent doesn't support the child, the young person, actually getting closer to purpose. In fact, they could do everything wrong. And I saw one example where you speak. It's like the idea of a parent. If a parent is going to work every day and the job is just about making money and the parent is coming home and complaining, that parent might want the best for their child, but the example is not helping the child either.
That's right. Or then complaining for sure, but even not communicating well. Some of the young people we interview, we ask them what their parents do, and they say, "Oh, well, Dad types stuff into the computer all day in his office." And we say, "Well, what does he type in, or what does he do?" And they don't know what the reason is. They don't know that he's, somehow causing some food to be delivered to a restaurant or a medicine to be produced or whatever the real purpose of the work is. And so the parent has not even bothered or had the opportunity to talk to the child about why what I'm trying to accomplish in my job, why I go to work every day. And the other thing that parents do sometimes that doesn't work out well in the long run is try to write the script of life for the child, to try to actually give the child the purpose that the child is supposed to then dedicate himself or herself to. The parent that says, well, we come from a family of lawyers, my grandfather was a lawyer, my father was a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, you're going to be a lawyer too. And that doesn't really work out so well usually. Kids usually need to find their own purposes, and the parent's role is to discuss it with the child, give the child options, give the child support, the resources the child needs to pursue the child's own dreams, but directly giving the child the direction in life that the child is supposed to take is not usually a successful strategy. Kids need to find their own interests in life if they're going to really commit to them.
I'm thinking of a short video, and I hope I'm not saying a name that causes you any discomfort, but there's the Eastern philosopher Alan Watts. He has this short video that says, what if money was no object? And he essentially paints the case exactly what you're saying, which is like, look, find that direction, find that purpose that you want. And if you are fully immersed in it, fully embracing it, going that direction, you're going to find the other things you need in life to get through life, for example, like money, etc. You'll find if you go that direction that feels best to you and you really embrace it, there's going to be an economic reward there if you go that direction.
And that's usually true. I think you do have to be, you have to inject some realism into it. The young person does need to get some feedback about whether the dream is actually realistic given what the young person is able to do. And I'll just give you an example of that. Is in every high school in the United States, there are usually a dozen or maybe more extremely talented kids who would love to go into theater or acting or directing or something like that. If you do the numbers, a couple of dozen young people in I don't even know how many thousands of high schools, that would swamp the entertainment industry way beyond what it could possibly handle. And not all of them are going to have the talent or even the luck or the opportunities to make it. At some point, there needs to be some testing of that dream, and it might well be that most of those young people are going to have to shift their ambition because it just isn't realistic, and find another dream, find something else that they could do. And if they love theater, maybe they could teach theater or something like that. But I think that not all youthful dreams are realistic, but I do agree with the idea that what should come first and foremost in your mind is what you believe in doing and what you really can dedicate yourself to, and then give it a shot, try it out, put yourself into it. But then see what happens, and you may need to be flexible and shift course a little bit because we don't always get exactly what we want in life. Sometimes you do have to make you have to make some adjustments.
I'm curious, Bill. Your career, very accomplished in where the directions you've gone. Are there any aspects of your career where your peers have pushed back in a way to say, well, gosh, Bill, I don't think that's the right direction? Or have you found throughout your career it's been more about uncovering, for all of us, aha moments where the vast majority of people go, gosh, that makes perfect sense, and Bill's done the research and the science is there and it makes sense?
Yeah, when I started doing the work on purpose, it wasn't really on the radar screen of at least rigorous scientific psychology or developmental science. some people said, you're getting into an area there that's almost spiritual, and this isn't the kind of thing that's ever going to fly with scientific journals. You'll never get funding. You'll never get research grants to support this work. It's just too out there. And that wasn't the first time that had ever happened to me either.
How early in life did that happen for you? How did you know your purpose was to keep pushing through those obstacles?
That's a really good question. I would say I kind of have to speculate here a little bit because, who knows really when you're thinking of your own life. But I would say that for me, there were some reasons that I had some confidence that I could do it because I know that I am able to see the big picture. That's one of my gifts, and I'm able to write about things in a compelling way. So I always figured that if I could just, even if I couldn't get a lot of support to do big research projects, and I failed to get grants, I always had the sense that if I could just get a few cases, I could write about it in a compelling way that would convince people. So that was part of it. I had some confidence in my own abilities, but I also know that I'm not very good at doing things that I'm not really interested in. So I went down the other road and just tried to spend my career doing things that people said were safe and were already on the radar screen so that it would be acceptable for people to do it. I kind of knew that that wouldn't work because I wouldn't do a very good job at that. I would lose interest and I wouldn't be very good at it anyway. So I didn't really have I didn't see it as a choice. I saw, I better give this a shot because it's really the only thing that makes sense, and I think I could do it. So I think it was something like that. And I also believe, just to say one more thing, when people say something like, well, purpose is more of a spiritual thing, or it's out on the outer edges, or it's a little bit on the frontiers. I also believe deeply that that's how science progresses, is by taking a chance and bringing in something that hasn't really been looked at before, because it's seen as being too remote or too hard to understand. And if you take a chance at doing that, that's how you really can make progress, if you're able to make it work.
You mentioned the pushback, perhaps early in your career. I'm not asking for names, but was it a motivational? Did that necessarily motivate you with the pushback?
That's a really good question, I think you're picking up on something in a funny kind of way that. Yeah, it does kind of tempt you to kind of go in the face of it, and that is how I felt a little bit, like sort of, oh yeah, they say I can't do it, I'll show them or something. There's a little sense of that. I'm not by nature.
It's not necessarily rational to pick that direction either.
Yeah, exactly. You could also make mistakes doing that, and I'm not, by nature a rebellious or contrarian person, but there is I think that's a natural reaction that a lot of people have. And by the way, I see that in a lot of our young subjects, that when their parents challenge them about their dream or what they want to do, sometimes that little bit of resistance really gets the kid going. And so I think what you're picking up on is not just something about me, but it's a natural human tendency to, up to a point, to get charged up if you think you're on the right track and somebody is saying no, or go slow, or don't tread there. It's a natural human tendency to say, oh yeah, I'm going to really give it a shot now. I'm going to really, really go for it.
I didn't plan this, but you all of a sudden became a good case study for this subject. I have one more question about you, though, because I think this would be useful for the audience, just as one example. Look, it's a small sample size, just you, but it's still interesting. So you go down this path, you kind of have this direction, this feeling that you want to go. You're doing your research. Give me a window of time. How long from when you first had the, gosh, Bill, that's not a very wise direction, to where you really don't get that anymore? How much time passed? What was that window where you had to display internal endurance to get to where you wanted to go? And you were going to go that direction anyways. Clearly I can see by the way you're thinking, it wasn't like, even if people never came to your side, you were probably still going to go that direction. But give me an idea of the time, how long you had to persist.
Yeah, That's a good question, and I actually have thought about that. And I would say this might sound like a long time, but I would say it's about 4 years before people then come around and say, you weren't just wasting your time, or this looks pretty interesting, or something like that. The skepticism lasted, 4-ish years before I got some recognition that I was on the right track.
And the reason I bring that up is because it could be less time, it could be more time, but generally, if you're going to go down this path of purpose, and there's going to be obstacles, there's going to be people that say it's not done that way. And as you mentioned, science is about experimentation and trying new and taking chances. You can't expect it to be overnight. That gets back to the short-term aspects that you have been fighting against.
You're right. I think you said it very well. And as you're speaking, I'm even thinking that it might even be a sign that you're trying something that ought to be tried if you initially get this kind of blank look from people, or this resistance, or this advice not to go there, or that you'll be wasting your time if you go there. That might even be a good sign, because it means you are onto something new. I mean, it doesn't always mean that, and sometimes those people might be right, and sometimes failure. Sometimes you take a direction and it doesn't work out, and failure is part of it, and that's okay too, because you keep going. So it doesn't always work out, but it could well be that skepticism is a sign that maybe you're really onto something that people aren't aware of yet.
Let me take it back to the young people perspective and this great 4-word mantra, you can do it. This is something that, we're going there in every part of this conversation, but the expressing to the young person, you can do it, that positive affirmation, you can do it. That's huge, isn't it?
I think those are the 4 most powerful and helpful words that a parent can say to a child. You just said those words, and that is a wonderful, great message that parents can give to every child, and it's a true message, because every child has something to contribute. Every child has a spark, and when the parent is the most admired child, the parent is the most admired person in the young child's life, and to hear that from the parent, you can do it, is so moving and helpful to the child.
Why are parents scared to say that sometimes?
I can't really answer that.
I love that. I love the fact that I know your academic career, and I love the fact that I'm sitting here right now in Saigon, Vietnam, and I can't get an answer. I love that.
Yeah, but sometimes it may just be that the parents aren't even aware that this would be helpful, or that they should be saying it. But I don't know. But I would say I'm sympathetic with parents. It's not easy being a parent. Parents have a lot of things on their mind. They have to keep the show going. They have to, as we say, bring home the bacon. They have to keep food on the table. They have to keep a roof over the head, and take care of the child. And the world is a tough place. They have hard things, sometimes health issues themselves. So parents don't always have the luxury to have the attention span even to be thinking about every single thing that's the best for the child. They're doing the best they can, but they're up against it too. So I'm very sympathetic with parents, and I know that parents, as a rule, most parents really love their children and would do anything for them.
So there is work out there. There are people that go down certain paths, academics, other people, and they make a case that, hey, this particular child had a really rough upbringing, really traumatic things, just parenting terrible. Perhaps there was not enough money, not enough food, not enough everything in the household. That doesn't have to be a lifelong limitation. So for those people, and I see this sometimes in America where we do create, even though it might not be on purpose, we create what I, in my mind, look at as excuses. Now, they might be very, very good excuses, as I just mentioned those things. There's something we can look forward to if we can get past where we all start. We all start with something different, but if we can get past, for example, the child, the young person that comes up with a very traumatic upbringing, there can be something positive on the other side, and it's literally just, can it be a light switch flip? Can it be an aha moment to get them going in an entirely different direction?
I think so, yes. I think, and you're onto something that really I think is the future of developmental psychology, actually, which is to turn things around from this old view that people used to have that began with Freud and so on, that we are determined by our early experience. And if we've had traumas, we're always going to have to be struggling and fighting with those, and we will be limited. The view that you've just mentioned is now being called prospective thinking. And it's the idea that we have the power and the ability to shape our own destiny by thinking to the future. And it is a kind of an aha revelation that even some of the difficult things you've been through give you an opportunity to develop strengths that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't had those challenges. Now, that doesn't mean forgetting the past. The past is always with us. It's important for people to own their pasts, and there will be some limitations that we've developed. But those limitations are not the end of the story. They don't determine our futures. In fact, the only thing that can determine our futures is ourselves, our own aspirations, our own determination, our own belief, our own sense of where to go. And purpose is a big part of that. The purposes we find in life and that we construct and that we develop are the road to a fulfilling future. And this was, by the way, this was the message that Frankl had when he was doing the writing. That's why he was such a visionary. And it's very much in keeping with the positive psychology movement, Marty Seligman's work, and the best in current thinking in the field. Carol Dweck's work about growth mindset, that we always have the capacity to learn, to grow, and to invent our futures.
I have one last question to go into, kind of a big picture question. We could talk probably for hours on this particular word, and I'm kind of going to combine it with the word that we've been using this entire conversation. So if I take purpose and I add moral to it, or we just examine the word moral, it's not a word that is, you don't flip on CNN or Fox or MSNBC and often hear the lead news story with the word moral. It seems like the word that we are running from so much in modern society. Well, let's don't talk about that. That's completely different for everyone. It's just not talked about. Speak to moral. Speak to, is it a moral purpose? Speak to, I think you probably have a decent feel for where I'm going.
Right. And I think people hesitate to use it because it sounds like too big a word, and it sounds almost controversial, like whose values should we call moral. But I would rather think of it in a way that's more common sense, that's more universal. If you just think about common decency, about being a decent person, being compassionate, being honest, the basic values that all people need to live a civilized life, to get along with each other, and to become trustworthy, to keep your word. If you think of moral in that way, and don't get into big ideological controversies or thinking of that as morality as being some heroic action that people have to take, but rather just the common decency that's needed to have good relations with the people you love, with your fellow citizens, to obey the laws in your society, and to be somebody that people can count on to make a positive pro-social contribution to the world. And I think that is a very important part of purpose, moral in that sense. And I would keep it at that level. That if you think of it like that, if everybody would just behave that way, there would really be much less problems in the world.
It's right there at the foundation, as you mentioned at the beginning. Like, how does one get towards happiness? Moral, as you just defined, talking purpose, this whole conversation, these are all huge keys to finding that happiness, huh?
I think so. I think that, if you have a life that you're proud of, that you feel comfortable with, that you look forward, you don't have to worry that you're doing something that's harmful to yourself or other people, that's the key. You can build on that all kinds of positive aspirations, and that's what we see when and I will say the good news is that a lot of people, including young people, are finding ways to do that these days. The rest of us are trying to learn from their examples.
So I can highly recommend people to go check you out at Stanford. One of your more popular books, The Path to Purpose. And for those people that really want to dig into the data, perhaps they think that we were being too general in this conversation, they can quickly go to your academic stop and find a lot of data, a lot of white papers. Is there a website we can send people to, Bill?
Yes, it's very simple. It's the Stanford Center on Adolescence, or Stanford COA. And if you just Google that, it will get you right to our website, and there's a big publications page with all of our work, all of our former students' work, all of our colleagues and collaborators, all of the most up-to-date data on purpose development. It's the Stanford Center on Adolescence, or Stanford COA. That's the website.
You know, it's amazing these days that everybody has their niche, their specialty, their direction they've gone. But if you take a moment to kind of, and this has happened to me in this conversation with you, if I take a moment to blur my eyes and open up this new door, then there's this whole group of people that have dedicated their lives to this direction. I find that, doing this podcast, I find that so much. So it's awesome. I appreciate your work and great insights. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks for the podcast and for all the good work you do.
I like to pride myself on this podcast for having the most comprehensive series of interviews with the most accomplished psychologist alive today. You can find all of those so far at trendfollowing.com/behavior. Today, I add to that list. My guest is Roy Baumeister. He is a social psychologist who's known for his work on the self, social rejection, sexuality, sex differences, self-control, self-esteem, self-defeating behaviors, and free will, to name a few. His book that you should check out, Willpower: Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. That's one of 20 plus books Roy has written. And if you do some quick searches, you will find that across the world, other psychologists routinely cite Roy's work. Innovative, eye-opening. I feel fortunate to continue to bring to this podcast those people that have spent the most time in their lives understanding what goes on in the 6 inches between our ears. Without further delay, my interview with Roy Baumeister. So, Roy, I want to jump into kind of a big picture question about you, because your topics are so damn fascinating to where you've gone in your career. And if I think about something about like willpower, self-control, two things I want to talk about in detail today. But give me the aha moment. I want you to talk about, what you've learned, and we're going to dive into that detail. But I want to know for you personally, obviously you're a very curious guy. When was the moment when you saw it? You saw it and you said, oh my gosh, I've got something here.
It's been a long process of discovery, and there are many different moments when things started coming together. Spent a long time trying to figure out the big picture of what human life is all about, why we're here and what we're doing and what we should be doing and all that sort of stuff.
Let me rephrase it for you. So if we're thinking about willpower, obviously got a great book out on this subject. Talk about how that started to unfold. Obviously you're making the point like, hey, Mike, this is a career spanning many decades, building on step by step by step. But were there any really big moments where you kind of had that light bulb moment, because you've really blazed some trails here, that light bulb moment where you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm really onto a path here that I have to keep exploring?
Back when I was in graduate school, I had to select something to focus on. And back then in the 1970s, a lot of social scientists were trying to learn about the self and identity and who they were. And people used many different approaches. It was also in the culture itself with the hippies who had moved from the sort of political, outward-focused activism of the 1960s into a more inward self-exploration, and sometimes sort of mystical exploration. Coming of age at that time, studying the self seemed part of it. And I then spent the first decade or so studying various things related to the self, of how people present themselves to others, dynamics of self-esteem, various things like that. And then somewhere in the late 1980s, I began to realize that people were starting to talk about self-regulation, and I got the understanding that this is not just one more thing that does, but is somehow a key to how it all fits together, how the self manages itself would be central. So I said, well, I just don't know very much about that. I better learn something. Spent a couple of years reading research literature on self-control. And there wasn't, like today, there are a lot of people explicitly studying that as their main focus. It was more scattered, and studies of dieting and people trying to quit smoking, restraint of aggression. I started to see common patterns there that looked that this was some kind of energy or willpower or limited resource. At the time, that sort of approach was very much out of fashion because psychology was dominated by the computer models of the mind. Everything had to be talked about in terms of information processing. I said, well, there are findings that seem to show up some patterns that don't really fit into a simple information processing model. It almost seems like there's some sort of energy involved, that when people are trying, say, to diet and lose weight, and they're also trying to quit smoking, they do a bad job of both, and plus become very difficult to be around for other people because they don't control their feelings, they get grumpy and so forth. So it looked like, again, there's a limited amount of energy, and you can put it into one thing or another, but when you're trying to do a lot of different things with that same amount of energy, you tend to mess up all sorts of things at once. So that was one of the first ideas. We had a book, Losing Control, back then that I had written as a scholarly book, but it sold much better than that. I was kind of surprised. I think that reflected the widespread appetite and interest, even outside of academia, in many people having problems with self-control, whether, again, it's drink or alcohol, whether it's alcohol or money or aggression or just the basic dieting, smoking sorts of things. Mentioned it as a sort of tentative formulation there. Some of my graduate students then started conducting experiments to see if that would work, and the studies worked quite well, consistent with the idea that, yes, if you exert self-control, that uses up some of your willpower, and then afterwards, at least until you can recover, your willpower is low, and so your self-control will be reduced or impaired.
Let me get you to talk about willpower some, and perhaps define it from your perspective. I think one of the things that really struck me going through your work, and it had never hit me, is that it's not that one task is more important than the other. If I'm studying to become, I'm taking my finals in engineering class and I'm picking what I'm going to make for breakfast. I mean, literally, we've only got so much willpower that we can exert, in the depletion aspect. It's just fascinating. So give me your perspective on willpower and kind of define it for the audience.
We took a long time before we came around to use that term. Psychologists are always hesitant to adopt terms that have folk meanings because they come with a lot of baggage and other assumptions. So initially we talked about it as a limited resource model of self-regulation, that sort of thing. But over time I became convinced, no, this is really pretty much exactly what people talk about when they talk about willpower. That would be the psychological energy that people use for self-control. The idea that self-control is an energy-consuming process. The energy would be the willpower. Now, that said, there are a couple other things that have emerged in the long run. First, you use willpower for more than self-control. We found that when people are making decisions, especially difficult decisions, that seems to use the same willpower, so that self-control will be impaired after you make decisions, and the other way around. If you exert self-control, deplete your willpower that way, then your decision-making gets less careful, less optimal, subject to all sorts of shortcuts and biases. Also, the idea that it's limited so that people run out. Well, as we started tying it into the body's energy supply, the modern, well-fed citizen of the world is usually not in much danger of actually running out of energy. Well, I think the body learned from our evolutionary past, when food supplies were much less reliable, learned to conserve its energy, especially when it's needed. You have more willpower than you think you have, but your body acts as if you're in danger of running out. One thing I've come to suspect recently, that I learned, for example, that glucose, which is the body's energy supply and seems to be involved in self-control and in willpower, the glucose is also used for fueling lots of the body's basic activities, including the immune system. If you get a brush with a cold, it's like some virus or a germs get into you, or if you get a cut and get an infection or something like that, then the body mobilizes, takes as much glucose as it wants. The immune system will suddenly start to burn a lot of your body's fuel, which means that when you're sick, your decision-making and your self-control are not as good as usual. And to put this in perspective, again, remember in our evolutionary past, there were no antibiotics, there was no medical treatment. In most of the history of human existence, people lived outdoors and were going barefoot, and you could easily get a scrape or a scratch that would get infected. And that could kill you if your immune system wouldn't take care of it. The body is designed to conserve its energy as much as possible. You didn't know back then when you could get another meal, and you didn't know when there'd suddenly be a severe demand to fight off some germs or infections. And that's why I think the body is overly oriented toward conserving its energy, and these ego depletion effects, where after exerting self-control, the body conserves its energy, so you're poorer at the next self-control task or decision task that comes along. It's not that you cannot do it, and if something's sufficiently important, you can usually muster up plenty of energy to handle that, although then you're that much more depleted, and the body really then tries to conserve its energy. So I think that's where we are now. There's some dispute how science works. Scientists argue about everything and try to pick and come up with other theories, and that's how progress moves forward. There's some disputes as to how much glucose is really involved, but in our studies, it's worked very consistently. When people's self-control is depleted, if we give them a dose of glucose, which is sort of any calorie-rich food, then that seems to restore their self-control. I think it's because the body thinks, okay, we don't have to conserve as much now. I can go ahead and put forth the effort. But if you need to, you can. It's a long way before you really start to run out of glucose. And as I said, it's much more of a danger in our evolutionary past than it is today.
You know, you've got decades of experience in being in so many of these topics. I've seen it in your work. Obviously, it's a huge statement from you. Self-control, the greatest human strength, one of the greatest human strengths. Contrast that with something, though, that you brought up earlier, just briefly. You mentioned self-esteem. I believe your work originally, not necessarily your work, but your exposure originally would have been more towards self-esteem versus self-control. Speak to self-esteem and some of the lessons we've learned from a focus on that over the years.
I started doing research on self-esteem back in the 1970s when the word was not commonly known in our society. I mean, people knew what it meant, but it was not the buzzword that it is today. I remember talking with the professor I wanted to do my senior thesis with at Princeton, where every student has to do a thesis in her senior year. And he went through a list of attitude change and stuff and then mentioned self-esteem. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe do some work on that. And I did my thesis on that, and it was also remained through graduate school, my dissertation. That was a big part of my dissertation. And I continued then into into the 80s, people with high and low self-esteem are really different kinds of people, and they do, so it's a good start to any research design to compare them and see how they act differently. So my studies worked pretty well, but I remember also at one interdisciplinary meeting with a bunch of sociologists, and one of them said, "How come self-esteem doesn't do anything?" I sort of took offense and said, "What do you mean it doesn't do anything?" He says, "Well, we put it in our national surveys, and it hardly seems to predict anything." Now, they were using a measure that I thought wasn't that good. That sort of alerted me to be a little skeptical, and maybe what I was studying were the most promising things, and the things sociologists are interested in, education and income and things like that. Maybe self-esteem didn't have so much value there. Perhaps ironically, it was in the 80s that the society started to think, oh, self-esteem is important, and maybe people are suffering or failing or making bad choices because of a lack of self-esteem. And maybe if we can raise everyone's self-esteem, the students will learn better in school, and young people will stay off of drugs and avoid premature pregnancy or unwanted pregnancy. And list of benefits for self-esteem that were touted back when I think California had a task force to try to promote self-esteem through the state. Some of the people were saying, this is going to solve the state's budget problem. California often has money problems. They said people with high self-esteem earn higher salaries, and so they pay more taxes, and if we can just raise everyone in California's self-esteem, there'll be more money flowing into the state's coffers. And, looking back, it looks kind of ridiculous, but there was this excitement at the time, and this hope that, the reason minorities don't flourish in our society is because they've been getting a message that they're inferior and they have lower self-esteem. And so if we can just boost their self-esteem, it will enable them to thrive and flourish. There's a lot of very idealistic hopes pinned on it. Unfortunately, the research as it came along didn't really back that up. I began to be skeptical myself. Yes, for the limited things that I was studying, how a person in the lab responds to a failure experience. Well, the person with high self-esteem does tend to bounce back and say, I know I can do this. Whereas the person with low self-esteem gets failure feedback and thinks, oh, I'm just no good. I can't do it. That is more prone to give up. Self-esteem works for things like that, but all those other hopes about keeping kids away from smoking and drugs and sex and so on, earning more money and all that didn't really seem to materialize.
To quote you from a presentation that I caught, you described self-esteem as mostly a flop.
I'm sorry to say, and I say this as someone who was really early on the self-esteem bandwagon and wished it were the panacea and the key to everything. I'd have been launching at the White House and solving our nation's woes. But self-esteem just didn't seem to deliver on the promises. Around this time, I set out to write a book on evil. I knew everyone said that, low self-esteem is a major cause of aggression and violence. And I saw this repeated everywhere. I was looking forward to seeing what the evidence was. And by this time, I was already suspicious a little bit because self-esteem didn't seem to have these benefits, so high self-esteem wasn't going to prevent that. And my impression was the really aggressive, obnoxious people I knew were not people full of self-doubts and questioning themselves and giving in to what other people say, which is what low self-esteem people do. Rather, they seem to have huge egos and think they were better than everyone else. So I started looking through the literature there, and this was another aha moment that you asked about. I realized that everybody was repeating the mantra that low self-esteem caused aggression, but nobody had shown it. Everybody cited somebody else, but then I'd go look up that original source, and they just said they got it from someone else. So everybody said it and repeated it, but nobody had provided evidence, and nobody had provided a definitive test of the theory. And so then I went and researched all these sort of violent, aggressive people to learn what they're like, and over again, they were huge egomaniacs, thinking they were better than other people, not that they were inferior. And it's not that high self-esteem causes aggression either. It's sort of one subcategory of high self-esteem of people who really are sort of narcissistic and want to believe they're better than others and are insistent on it, and who really care about what other people think of them. There are some people with high self-esteem who just hold a favorable opinion and nothing phases them. And they're not very aggressive. They kind of go through life thinking they're great, doesn't matter what happens. They don't get mad or defensive or anything like that. But the people whose self-esteem is really dependent on having other people admire them and tell them they're great, they respond very negatively if someone bursts their bubble.
You mentioned that if self-esteem would have been the path, perhaps you would have ended up at the White House dinner. And that leaves me thinking as I go through your work, and I'm looking at your work on willpower and self-control, and especially when I think about self-control, how when you connect it with ego depletion and whatnot, you look at that, you're like, wow, what an aha moment of the way to refocus and perhaps take really concrete steps to change my life. So now that seems like an insight that the policymakers would be like, oh my gosh, this is great. Let's get Roy up here to the White House. Let's talk about self-control. But self-control, as an outsider looking in, and I'm curious your perspective, self-control by its very nature to say that could stir up, I would think, political emotions.
I remember when our first book on self-control came out, it got reviewed by a psychologist who said, well, this is a sign of some kind of neoconservative movement in psychology. And I thought, what? That's ridiculous. I'm not political, certainly not neoconservative. So there was nothing political in the book. It was a very cautious survey of the research. But as I read more over time, it is something that conservatives believe in more than liberals. Liberals tend, look to society as to blame for people's problems, and conservatives are a little bit more about taking responsibility yourself. Even though I think of it as a politically neutral topic, there are people who associate it with the more conservative personal accountability kind of political view. And in terms of the White House, I don't like to get involved in these political things.
It is something, though, and I'm sure you believe this. You've spent many years at this, and I know you've probably seen people make changes, that if people can accept the idea that they only have so much willpower and self-control ties in and you can get depleted, if people can grasp that basic scenario, that basic landscape, that's like magic for the larger population to have more success in their life.
Oh, yes. I think in many ways self-control fulfills the promise that self-esteem could not. Boosting self-esteem doesn't seem to make people's lives better in any broad way, but improving self-control absolutely does. And where self-esteem broke down, even when it was, and self-esteem was in a way an honest mistake because it was correlated with lots of positive things, that people who are successful and popular and well-liked and so on have higher self-esteem than losers. But the self-esteem is more a result than a cause. And when they started tracking people over time, they saw that early self-esteem doesn't lead to later success. But with self-control, it does. There are remarkable studies that measure self-control at ages 10 or even 7. In one of our papers, children in school were rated by their teachers on self-control when the kids were 7 years old. And it predicted adult behaviors, including unemployment and smoking, various other long-term outcomes. The big New Zealand study, self-control measured at 10, predicts in your 30s whether you've ever been arrested and how much money you make and all sorts of other important outcomes. Self-control really is an important key to the better life. And what I also like to say about it is that you can improve it, as far as our studies suggest. The only other trait that seems to have the breadth of impact in terms of making life better alongside self-control is intelligence. Although we've been trying for a long time, producing a lasting change in someone's intelligence is very difficult. But we can improve people's self-control. So to me, this is one of the most important and promising keys, the way we can make life better for people. So I tell parents and educators and everyone else, forget about self-esteem, concentrate on self-control. That's the gift that keeps on giving. Bring up a child with good self-control. It's better for that person, the child as an adult, better for society also.
You bring up the ability to change or improve self-control. That it's not just something that's you're stuck in, let's say, K through 12 or something. This is over the course of a lifetime, self-control can be improved.
What some people have been doing is have people do self-control exercises for a couple of weeks, or in some cases for a couple of months. It's like a muscle. So any exercise you do makes the muscle stronger and will help with other things, even unrelated to what you're exercising. There was a group down in Sydney, Australia. Had people they work on trying to make a plan to save money. So they got better at saving money. I met with them several times over, I think, 3 or 4 months. They got better at saving money, so that's not surprising. But they also then did better on laboratory tests of concentration. They reported their study habits improved, and they were less likely to leave the dirty dishes in the sink. So, in small ways, their self-control improved. They even ate healthier food, and healthy food costs more than junk food. That went against the money saving, their primary goal to save money. That's what they were working on, and yet it ended up having the side effect that they ate healthier foods alongside that.
Given my background, I got my MBA from Florida State. You spent many years there, and I've had someone else on this show from Florida State, Anders Ericsson. I would assume you both know each other quite well. Is there anything you would share with the audience? 2 guys that have really blazed trails in the psych field down paths that are, the word's not similar, but very eye-opening work to really let people into insights they might not otherwise know. Is there anything you would share about your conversations with Anders over the years? Any debates, agreements, things that you guys share?
I don't know quite what to say. Anders is one of my best friends at Florida State, and kind of leaving Florida State now, but I certainly miss him, and I try to connect whenever I go back. Great man, of course, an expert on experts. Been interested in his opinions and conclusions about expertise, and I like his optimism that if you practice long and hard, you can excel at almost anything. I know he's skeptical of that there are any differences in talent, and I have to believe there's some differences in talent. But that's a side point. The main point, how people become experts and who are experts, I think that's been inspiring. So I've been enjoying seeing his success.
I asked that question. I did not know the answer. And it's always a little dangerous to ask these types of questions, but I figured, it's a fairly small community. You guys are essentially in the same department. So I figured, there was probably some connective tissue there. It was probably safe to ask. So I'm glad I feel safe asking it now when you use the phrase one of your best friends. So
yeah, you can't, it wouldn't be true of everyone there. There's nobody I disliked at Florida State, but in a department of over 40 people, some you're closer to than others. But Anders is one of my favorite people.
Let me take you back into your headspace. I want to talk about the restraining of desire. And you've got some really interesting insights about the restraining desire. I mean, I love this part. This is just kind of a number, and I'll let you run with it, that we're in this state of desire 8 hours a day, kind of a 4 hours a day that we're resisting. And then maybe, I think you said like a half hour a day we're giving in to a desire from a prior time, perhaps. Explain this to people. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, those numbers are extrapolations, but the way we got them is we had people wear beepers. Nowadays you switch and just use the cell phone for the same thing. The idea in this is called experience sampling, which is you take a random sample of what the person's doing at random moments throughout the day. So they carry around this little device and doing their ordinary things, like get up and have breakfast and go to work or school or whatever they do. And then at various points, the beeper goes off, and we ask them some questions. So at that moment when the beeper went off, were you having a desire? The 8 hours a day came from the observation that about half the time when we beeped people, they said they were wanting something at that moment. They were having a desire, maybe 2 or 3 desires, but they were having at least one desire. And about half the time they said, no, I'm not having any desire right at this particular moment. We extrapolated and figured people are awake for 16 hours, so half of the time if they're having a desire, that's where we got the 8 hours. And the other numbers are the same sort of extrapolation. How often are they resisting a desire? I think but it was about 40% of the time, if they said they were having a desire, they were resisting it. We figured 3 to 4 hours. If you're in a state of desire for 8 hours, 3 to 4 hours, you were resisting that. Other desires people have, and don't try to resist them. That's the basis for those numbers. We set out on this project because desire is what psychologists call motivation. It's one of the most fundamental psychological properties, and yet it's not well understood at all. We know a lot about thinking, what people are thinking, and in this laboratory work and other sorts of work on thoughts, and to some extent people are thinking something almost all the time. But basic questions about desire and motivation, the answers were not known. We had no idea really how often people would say they were in a state of desire. They might have, it wouldn't have shocked us if they were in a state of desire 3/4 or 90% of the time, or maybe they only reported 2 or 3 desires all week. It was trying to collect basic facts and information, set us off on that journey. We did then include measures of self-control and restraint, and how often, when you're trying to restrain a desire, how successful are you? We said sometimes people resist for a while and then go ahead and give in and do it anyway. But resisting is quite effective. People certainly act on their desires a lot less when they reported resisting them than when they weren't resisting.
But resisting also depletes too, right?
Absolutely, yes. The more often they reported resisting a desire as the day wore on, the weaker their resistance got. In other words, the more likely they were later on to report having a desire and resisting it, and then giving in and doing it anyway.
Can I ask a question? Just it strikes me when we're talking about the resisting of desires. I'm thinking across the globe, very different countries, very different cultures, different religions. And some religions really focus on the resisting of desire a lot more than others. Did that come up in your research at all?
I've not done any comparative religion research. Religious people in general exhibit higher self-control. This is not my work, this is other people's work, but I'm quite persuaded by the evidence and the conclusion. In general, yes, religions do advocate self-control. They probably build self-control in a variety of ways. I mean, exactly how religion has the effect, there are competing theories about. One is that religious people who think God is always watching you, well, then you bet you don't try to get away with something, because God will know, just as people behave better when other people are watching than when they're alone and they think nobody will know. But it also could be strengthening the self-control muscle that religious exercises, like on Sunday you're not supposed to go to work, you're supposed to dress up in your best clothes and go to church, or regular exercise of prayer or meditation. All these little things are, among other things, they're self-control exercises, and so maybe they help build the self-control muscle so that it's stronger. So the evidence is clear. Actually, Mike McCullough, who did some of this work, he started noting the data that religious people live longer than not religious people. And religious people, of course, they want to say, well, it's because God is looking out for me or something like that. But that's not, postulating that God is intervening is not really a scientific theory. And plus, it seemed to be all different religions. There didn't seem to be any one religion that was better than others. In general, religious people live longer. So you say, well, how do we explain it then? What is it that makes religious people have this advantage in terms of living longer? People don't do as many dangerous things, whether it's drinking and smoking and taking drugs, or having sex with the wrong person that gets in trouble that way, or robbing things or whatever. So again, this self-control seemed to be a crucial mediator. And then other evidence came along. Sure enough, self-control is probably the single personality trait that has the biggest benefit for prolonging life. Psychologists measure all these different traits. Somebody said, well, I wonder, certain kinds of people live longer than others, and what would be the traits? And they started with intelligence, and there is some effect there. Smart people live a little bit longer than stupid people. But when they discovered the self-control, conscientiousness dimension that swamped everything else, that was the big effect. That's really what helps people live longer.
As I go down the path for asking religious significance, it gets me thinking, since I'm in an Asian country right now, and we can see this across Asia, we can see this across America with Asian students. And let's just talk about students for a moment. I'm sure you've seen this firsthand. But Asian students, I would think, just listening to you, looking at your work, I think I would have to kind of just draw the conclusion that they have a greater degree of self-control.
Yes, we researched this. This is covered in the Willpower book. My co-author, John Tierney, who is a New York Times science writer, he looked into this fairly extensively, although had me also go and look up some of the basic research things. And it does appear that, yes, Asians have it. They have a reputation for being slightly more intelligent than other races. There are arguments on both sides there. If they're more intelligent, it's not a big difference. Certainly not enough to account for their success. But their strong family orientation, and the family brings up the kids to have self-control, to do their work and obey and work toward the future. A lot of value on education. So you do your homework and you get good grades and you practice your piano all the time. They are brought up with a stronger focus on self-control, and that contributes to their success. I remember one set of data that impressed me was, what is the minimum IQ you need to be successful in a professional occupation like a medical doctor or a lawyer or something like that? You know, how smart do you have to be before you can succeed at that? And the number for Asians was substantially lower. I forget what the exact numbers were. In America, these days, your average white or black person needs to be pretty smart to succeed in those careers. The Asian can be successful with a lower IQ, which, again, is explainable in terms of self-control and self-discipline. Make sure not to screw up and get the most out of their other talents. And I think that's an important key to understanding the benefits of self-control. It enables you to get the most out of your capabilities. You can live up to your potential with discipline and hard work and long-term application and a focus on the future, all those things that self-control brings.
I'd love to shift you for the limited time we have left, because you have so many topic areas in your career, but I think there's one that I might get people thinking about here that I want to go into, which is culture and human sexuality, which is something that you've done a lot of work in. And I would love for you to dive into something very simple. I want to read a statement here and explain what this means for people. Female sexuality is more cultural and male sexuality is more natural.
That was a big project I did about 20 years ago. First of all, understand that the nature versus culture debates are everywhere in the social sciences. You know, are people born this way? Are they biologically shaped this way? Or is it all a matter of socialization, training, parents, peers, media, stuff like that? But in the field of sex, there's a particularly intense debate there, and we've seen the pendulum swing way back and forth. The sexual revolution, really in the 1970s, showed that sexual behavior could change quite a bit in a short period of time, suggesting that we shouldn't rely too much on nature, and that was a big stimulus to the people that said, oh, sex is all about culture. And everybody, I think, who does sex research knows that there's some mixture. I mean, there's some, but the recipe differs widely, and so some people are saying, okay, yeah, there's some hormones and stuff like that, but basically who wants to do what to whom, how many times, and in what position, and so on. But that's all the result of culture and cultural influences. Whereas others, with this evolutionary psych approach and so on, they say, yeah, the basic patterns of desire were shaped way back even before humans evolved in terms of what sorts of practices produced the most offspring. I remember David Buss's comment or a thought experiment say, well, if you go back to the past, suppose half the men desired to have sex with old women and half desired to have sex with young women. And suppose everybody got his wish and merrily had sex. Well, who are we descended from? The old women, don't have children. So those men who desired them, they would have taken themselves out of the gene pool. We're only descended from the men who wanted to have sex with young women. So that would be a nature kind of approach. There are these two camps in the field of sex research, the constructionist emphasizing culture, and the feminists are all very strongly on that side, and then the biology-oriented nature ones saying it's really how we evolved. And it's more than just a polite disagreement. They really seem to loathe each other and think the others were charlatans. When I come into a field like this, I try to size up what both sides have and what's right about them, and then try to put it together. And I started getting the impression that, well, maybe there's a difference between men and women on this. The evolutionary psychologists tended to be men, and the constructionists and feminists tended to be women. So I wondered, could it really be that female sexuality responds to cultural and social influences more than male sexuality? And then I started reviewing the evidence for that, and it was overwhelming that this was obviously true, and kind of shocked me that nobody had noticed it before. Things like the most educated versus the least educated women have very different sex lives, but the most educated, least educated men, not so different. Same with religion. Highly religious women, very different sex lives than the non-religious women. The men, they'll talk different values, but in terms of what they do and what they desire and so on, they're depressingly similar. It went on and on, influence of peers, influence of parents, everything all the social factors seem to have stronger effects on women than on men. Whereas when they do like twin studies, much has been done, for example, with being homosexual with being gay. So if one twin is gay, what is the odds that the other one is gay? And you can look at the degree of natural influence there. And that seemed to suggest that the biological things were much stronger for men than for women, including the homosexual orientation seems to be much firmer and more unchanging and more biologically determined for men than for women. I phrased this using the biological term plasticity. How much does the behavior respond to the environment? So the erotic plasticity is higher in women than in men. There's no value judgment. It's not clearly better to be one way or the other. Perhaps a few minor advantages and disadvantages to each. It seems very much true that female sexuality responds to circumstances. It depends on what it means. It's harder for women to get to understand their own sexuality because it's a moving target, whereas for the man, it's pretty much the same. What he wants to do at 20 is the same stuff he wants to do at 60. Doesn't want it quite as much at 60. Even sexual problems and therapies, when they came out with Viagra, that solved most of men's sexual problems. And it's a purely biochemical intervention. They used to take men who were having erectile problems and put them in Freudian psychoanalysis and ask them all about their mother and talk for years, and it never did much good. They come up with a pill, and that does it. And the women are wishing for a pill to solve their sexual problems, but that kind of thing remains elusive. For the woman, it depends a lot more on what it means, and so she really needs the talking cure. Right after I completed this, there was another study that came out in Great Britain, I think, looking at sexual problems. And for men, sex problems correlated with physical health problems. And for women, sexual problems correlated with mental health problems. Again, it's much more psychological, social, situational, cultural that shapes the female sexuality. Even the sexual revolution itself, women changed much more than men did. The men. I was growing up during this, and certainly it was a nice time to be a young man. You had a lot more chances to do what you wanted to do after the sexual revolution than before. But the basic patterns of what men wanted to do and liked and so on, they didn't really change that much, whereas women changed much more fundamentally in terms of their feelings about their bodies and their attitudes towards sexuality, and experimented with different things. So there was a big cultural event, again, showing a much bigger effect in women than in men. So that's what I meant when I said female sexuality is more cultural and men is more natural. Both are both, but the recipe of nature and nurture is different. There's a bigger dose of nurture women and men.
Let's talk about, while we're in the same headspace, same territory, analyzing sexual interactions in the phrase sexual economics.
As I mentioned a moment ago, the main disciplines outside of psychology that sex researchers borrowed from, the evolutionary people borrowed from biology, that's evolutionary theory, and the feminist constructionists borrowed from politics, saying that sex was a political act and so on. So we thought, well, maybe economics would have some useful insights. I've been reading lots of research literature on sex, and things seem to be amenable to that. And my colleague Kathleen Voss and I really surveyed a great deal of evidence and started to look at principles like supply and demand. It starts from the assumption that sex is something that men want from women. I think there was one scholar had remarked, made that line already back in the late 70s, that everywhere in nature, sex seems to be something that the females have and the males want from them. So what that means is when the man and woman get into bed and have sex, it's not exactly an equal expression of love or anything, although idealistically portray it that way, but rather the man is getting something from the woman. And if that's true, then, and it's presumably true because men have a stronger desire for sex than women, the male sex drive is much more frequent than the female, and there's a tidal wave of evidence supporting that. We had to review that separately, but just about any measure of interest or desire for sex, men show higher amounts. Well, then, if one person wants something more than the other, then you have to sweeten the deal, and that's like you said, that's why the man buys dinner for the woman. Even today, ostensible gender equality, and women earn as much, sometimes more than the men they're dating, but it's still the assumption that the man should buy her gifts and pay for dinner and take her out and so on. Because, again, if she's contributing sex, the male sexuality has no exchange value. We applied things like the law of supply and demand. It's one of the basic economic principles. It seems to be true in marketplaces everywhere. And sure enough, sex norms change. Scholars have done really nice, thorough jobs of sexual norms change based on the local sex ratio. So that when there's a surplus of men, more men than women, then that means the demand exceeds the supply. Now, if it were politics, it would be majority rule, right? And when mostly men are around, then the men get it their way. But no, in the mating market, if there are mostly men around, then the men have to do whatever the women want. And that's usually the man has to make a long-term commitment to a marriage or something like that and invest a lot of money and other resources, basically sign up to provide for her for the rest of her life before sex can commence. So that happens. Well, we're seeing that in China right now because there's a shortage of women due to selective abortion. It was true, say, in the Wild West or patterns when men migrate to a place much more than women. Then women can dictate the terms of sex. In contrast, when there's a shortage of men, then the supply exceeds the demand, and so the price goes down, and the woman can't hold out for a wedding ring. She barely even ask him to be faithful. See that after a major war, where a lot of the men have been killed, the ones who had to survive the war and get lots of sex with multiple partners in some low-income minority communities in various parts of the globe. There's a shortage of men because sometimes the men have left or they're in prison or they die young for whatever reason. Anyway, the shortage of men means again that the sex is free and easy, plenty of premarital, extramarital sex. The woman really can't ask for very much because the man can easily move on and find someone else. There's lots more to that, but the sexual economics, it's a very unromantic theory of sex. It's not one of my favorite of my own theories, and I sort of would prefer to have a more romantic or idealistic version be true, but there's a ton of evidence that really makes that quite compelling patterns.
You know, what I love about your work is there are topics where one could get political really quick. There could be value judgments really quick. But what I like about your work and your presentation is that it's just like, hey, here's the research, here's the facts, here's what we found out. And it kind of leaves me with the feeling of like a little bit of common sense. Like, hey, we should know this, but we just were blinded or blurred, or we didn't look closely enough. But I just like the fact that this, listening to you and looking at your work, is really not political. It's just here it is.
As I said, I'm not political. I don't even vote. I'm just trying to remain neutral. And other people who are political often take exception to my findings, and it's probably prevented me from getting some awards or things like that because people don't like it. But if you really want to just find the truth and put together the big picture, you're going to have to accept some things you don't like. The world is just not made the way that we would ideally like it to be. And I find I really want to end up knowing what's right, so trying not to care how things are. Sometimes you have to care. Caring just slows you down. It makes you slower to recognize what the facts are, wishing that they were different. My goal, I figured I started out not knowing the right answers. I wanted to end up knowing the right answers. And that also meant I was going to have to change my mind a lot of times, and I was going to have to get used to that. So that's been my approach. I said it's not for everybody. But people are just endlessly fascinating. And like I said, I want to end up knowing what the truth is, whether I like it or not.
Well, Roy, I appreciate you taking the time today. Fantastic stuff. I think you're 20-plus books, so people will have to go onto Amazon and make some choices. Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength is one people can check out. Relatively recent. Roy, is there a website we can send people to? Any place you'd want them to come find out more? There's a ton of white papers, a ton of research everywhere. You're easily found, but is there a particular website you want them to perhaps check out?
I do have a website, roybaumeister.com, I think. But that should be easy to find. I don't maintain it myself. I have some other people help, so it just gets updated a few times a year. But it certainly keeps up more or less with my books and other progress.
YouTube is a great one these days, too. You are on YouTube quite a bit.
Okay, I don't watch YouTube, so I don't know. I've heard people say they've seen me there. Partly people send me links to things that they're and so on. And to myself, I'm boring, so I don't like to watch myself or see pictures of myself or read my readings about myself. But I'm very curious about other people. I'm really hoping the next few years I'll have a couple more really important integrative books where we can start to put together the big picture and advance understanding as far as I can before my little time is up.
Well, I will stay tuned and hope to see those next new books.
Okay, well, thanks, Mike.
As a little extra to my interview with Roy, I'd like to include about a 30-minute presentation that he made in the last few years that expands on and clarifies even more of the issues that we talked about today.
The subtitle of our book was Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. Now, people say a lot of things to sell books, but my background's as a scientist, and we're not supposed to say things we can't make a good case for. So is it plausible? Are there data that would suggest self-control really is that important, that central to human life and happiness? And I think, yes, the answer is very positive here. More data coming out all the time showing that people who have good self-control are more successful in school when they're young and in their work when they're older and grown up, and make more money, become more prominent and successful. They're also better at relationships. They're more popular with other people. People trust them more. They have stronger marriages and intimate romantic relationships and so on. They are happier. They have lower stress. I mean, after all, one of the best ways to reduce stress in your life is to stop screwing up. So if people with good self-control can do that, it'll make life easier for them. They're better adjusted, fewer drinking problems and drugs and eating disorders and stuff like that. And overall, better mental health, better physical health too. They behave better, commit fewer crimes, less likely to be arrested, fewer traffic accidents, partner abuse, prejudice, everything like that. And at the far end of life, they live longer. And by way of contrast, I started my career studying self-esteem. I spent a long time with that, and those of you here this morning heard Gene Twenge tell you some of the failures and pitfalls of self-esteem and just thinking you're great. We had hoped that self-esteem was going to provide a lot of these benefits, but self-esteem was kind of a flop. Self-control seems to be the real deal and really does make life better. Now, what is it? By self-control, it's a way of changing yourself. I think psychology thinks of behavior in terms of a stimulus and a response. And so it's a way of changing the response. You don't have to do the first response or the first impulse that you can do. You can change something about yourself and change your thoughts, change your emotions, resist impulses to do the wrong thing, improve your performance. In the scientific literature, they often use the term self-regulation. And I like the term regulation because it implies change, but not just any change. It's change based on an idea of how it should be. And the government says they're going to regulate how buildings are made or something. It makes rules. It doesn't say just do it differently, but there have to be certain standards for how a building should be made. It should have windows and bathrooms and all those things. So in the same way, self-regulation is changing yourself based on idea of how you should and should not be. It's vital for human social life. I mean, we live in society with lots of rules. That's part of what culture is. It works when most people follow most of the rules most of the time, but they have to change their behavior to follow the rules. Morality, doing the right thing, sometimes called self-control the master virtue, because most other virtues depend on your being able to resist the temptation to do sin and vice and so on, and do the right thing. Even free will very much starts with self-control, with the ability to change yourself based on how you think you should act. Now, how often do they use it? Well, we had this experiment that we ran a couple of years ago where we had a couple hundred people wear beepers all day just to find the path of their desire. Whenever the beeper went off at random points during the day, they're supposed to stop and say, when the beeper went off, were you having a desire? Did you want something? And if so, what did you want? How much did you want it? Did you resist it? And did you end up doing it anyway? So we found all these things about it. And sure enough, when people had a desire, there was a big difference as to whether they resisted it or not in terms of whether they actually enacted the behavior. If they didn't resist it, it's not 100%. You want things that even when you don't resist the desire, you may not be able to do it because it's raining or you don't have a gun or whatever. Things beyond your control prevent you from enacting the impulse. But, so it's 70%. But if you resist, again, that's also not down to 0%. Self-control is not perfect. I'm sure that doesn't come as a surprise. But there's a huge difference, 70% down to 17%. So people resisting their desires very effectively, and this is on a daily basis. This is things happening quite a bit, quite frequently every day. Indeed, we found people reported having a desire about half the time that they were contacted. So yes, every day we are resisting desires, and it's not just some huge, powerful desire to commit some heroic or dastardly act or something like that, but rather ordinary things like resisting the urge to laugh at the wrong joke, or not to laugh, or to not go to the bathroom, or all these little things that you do. They do involve controlling our behavior and in many cases resisting impulses. So, as I said, we found about 8 hours a day people are in a state of desire out of 16, about half the time we beeped them. Among those, 3 to 4 hours, a lot of them are resisted. So people are using self-control to resist desires quite a bit. And then there's a glorious or naughty half hour a day when you give in and do something that you've been trying to resist, and you go ahead and have the piece of cake or whatever. How are we doing with those chocolates? Key point in my research is that your willpower is limited. It operates like a strength or an energy source that gets used up. We started to talk about these in lab terms as ego depletion, in the sense that the self consists of some energy that gets used up when you use it. And that conclusion derived from a lot of experiments. Here's one of the early ones. Let me describe a little bit how the experiment was done. You can't bring someone in the lab and tell them we're going to test your self-control, because then people get all weird. What's often necessary to do in our experiments is tell them we're studying one thing and actually study something else. So we told them we're studying how well they can remember certain tastes. And so it was important that they not eat anything for 3 hours prior to the experiment. So anyway, the person comes experiment and they've skipped lunch or whatever, and a little bit hungry. And I guess the next part was kind of mean. We set up a microwave oven in the laboratory and baked chocolate chip cookies. You know how it blows out the aroma. So the laboratory just smelled so wonderful. We knew it was good because we got lots of complaints from people across the hallway in the office building saying, I'm trying to do my statistics here and I'm smelling your cookies all day. So it was very tempting. Anyway, the person comes in, is hungry, skipped lunch, smells this delicious aroma of freshly baked pastries, and then we sit them at a table and there's a tray full of these things all looking nice and appealing. In case they weren't into cookies, there are also some chocolates in a nice tasteful arrangement. And also on the table there's a bowl of radishes. And by random assignment, sometimes experiment says, well, you've been assigned to the radish condition. So your task is going to be to eat some radishes and taste them, and don't touch the chocolates. They're for other people. And then we compared them with people who were told, go ahead and eat the chocolates and cookies, and then another group with no food, because you always want to see if there's something special about food. But the ones we're interested in are the ones who had to sit there wanting those chocolates and seeing those chocolates and smelling those chocolates, and had to resist that and make themselves eat those stupid radishes instead. So then we, of course, we didn't trust them, but we observed them secretly through a little hidden window, and they were tempted, all right. But they managed to, some close calls, and people were sniffing them and putting them back. But nobody bit into the forbidden food, and everybody managed to eat at least half of a radish. So then we took them to a different room where there's no food or anything, and borrowed this procedure from stress research where we see how long do people work at a task before they give up, because that's a test of self-control. Obviously, it has nothing to do with eating radishes, but it's another thing that requires willpower, because it's frustrating, you're not getting anywhere, and how long do you keep going before you give up and say, I just can't do it. And so the time till they gave up, that was the measure. The puzzles were actually unsolvable, so how long they would get it. And you see, resisting that temptation, using up their willpower to not eat the chocolates and cookies, that took something out of them so that they didn't have that anymore to help themselves keep working and keep trying and keep persevering at the task. All right, we went back actually to the beeper study, which was done some years later, and said, well, does this happen in regular life too? So we looked at if people had already resisted temptations, resisted desires during that day, how well did they do resisting the next desire that came along? If you look at the blue line on top, if they weren't resisting it, it didn't make any difference. They enacted it right at the same at about that 70% rate. But as you see the red line, that goes up. The more they resisted other temptations as the day went on, the weaker their self-control got. So yes, this is something that accumulates over the course of the day. As you use your self-control for one thing after another, it becomes weaker, and you become more prone to fail. You're more likely to give in and eat the chocolate or say the nasty thing that you are inclined to, or whatever you might later wish you had not done. Of course, we all want to be cited in the scientific literature, but the real goal of every scientist is to be cited in the cartoons. So here's one, got it, implying the idea willpower is depleted and it affects making decisions. Dilbert seems to have liked the point. So to understand self-control, it works like a muscle. That's what we found. What I've explained so far is like a muscle getting tired. When you use that muscle to resist one temptation, then it gets tired, and so then the next one, it's not quite as strong, and so on. And as the day wears on, it's more likely to fail. There are two other things that are like a muscle. One is your willpower is not gone. We initially thought, oh, maybe the person's used up all the brain fuel or something like that and can't do it anymore. No, they can do it if there's a good enough reason. It's really like when an athlete starts to get tired, and so you just start conserving your strength. You still have power in those muscles. You can still do a lot, but you sort of get a sense that I don't have unlimited energy, and your body automatically conserves. And that's the way it is with willpower. Your body will start conserving it after it has expended some. And we also find, meanwhile, that exercise, just like a muscle gets stronger in the short run, when you exercise, you're tired and your muscle feels weaker. But when you exercise regularly over a period of time, it will actually get stronger. And there are about a dozen published studies showing that if people do self-control exercises for a couple weeks, it will improve their self-control. David's going to come along in a few minutes and talk about meditation. Meditation seems to have that effect. One of the many effects of meditation is that it strengthens this capacity to control yourself. It increases your willpower. All right, let's move along. A number of methods have worked. We often, if you want to do exercises to improve your willpower, to improve your capacity to regulate your behavior and change, in our studies we've used fairly arbitrary things, like have people, if they're right-handed, we have them, just break the habit. Use your left hand for a variety of things. So we say drinking from a cup, brushing your teeth, opening doors, maybe using a computer mouse. Things like that. Just switch and use your left hand. The point is you have to exert self-control because your habit is to reach for the doorknob with your right hand, so you have to override that and use your left hand. People do these exercises for a couple weeks, and then they come back in the lab and take tests that have nothing to do with right or left hand, but test their self-control, and they've gotten better. It does seem to improve. The important thing is to start small. Start with things that you can do. The New Year's resolutions often have a bad reputation because people make a whole bunch of New Year's resolutions and then fail at all of them by the end of the month. Well, the thing is, most resolutions involve changing yourself, so they all require willpower. So if you have 5 of them, each time you work on one, you're taking away your capacity to work on any of the others. So no wonder they all fail. What you should do, I'm not going to say don't make New Year's resolutions, because I do believe in trying to improve. But what you should do is do them sequentially rather than all at the same time. If you have to make 5 New Year's resolutions, start with the easiest one and do that and actually succeed at it. And then you can move on to the next one and you'll be a little bit stronger. The old Victorian phrase that certain things build character, well, that is finding echoes in modern data. Yes, these exercises of self-control do make you stronger person in the old character building sense that the Victorians used the phrase. Important to recognize there's one willpower, there's one pot of energy. It's not, some people say, well, I have good self-control for getting my work in on time, but bad self-control for keeping my apartment clean, or vice versa. No, that's not right. You have one pot of energy. It's the same self-control, but it's limited, so it makes sense. People will apply it to one thing, and some people will use it to get their work done on time. Other people will use it to keep their apartment clean or other things, but it is finite. So people allocate it differently. But still, again, controlling thoughts, feelings, restraining your desires and appetites, and making yourself perform effectively. All these draw on the same source of energy. Now, in fact, willpower is used even beyond self-control. Things like decision-making, that people make decisions, that uses up some of the same energy. This was a big extension of the work. Likewise, initiative, being active instead of passive, that seems to take some energy and so on. So after people have exerted self-control, they'll make different decisions in different ways, probably more shallow and shortcut kind of decisions. When people are depleted, they've used up some of their willpower, they're more likely to try to avoid making decisions. They, I don't want to decide today, things like that. They're less prone to compromise, not just compromising with others, but even compromising in a difficult decision where you have to trade off different variables. For example, price and quality and so on. That usually a person who's got all your willpower, if you want some quality, but you want to save some price too, so you'll kind of compare them and look for the sweet spot where you get the right value and things that satisfy your needs. But that's difficult, and so when people are depleted, what they'll do is fall back on just give me the cheapest or give me the best, but not really trade them off. When there's a default option, people will take that. They're more self-indulgent in their decisions. Irrational biases can creep in as well. I should also say when people are depleted, their self-control is down, their intellectual performance deteriorates. Their logical reasoning is worse. We've given people IQ tests after they've exerted self-control, like after the radish manipulation or whatever, and they actually do worse on that as well. This has gotten into the news too. There's a picture of our American president. He's looking very dapper in his gray suit. Well, it turns out he only wears gray suits, as he acknowledged in an interview. He, or presumably someone on his staff, read the New York Times coverage of our work and said, aha, well, the president has all these decisions to make, and very few of them easy ones, because the easy ones get done below him. So he says, well, I don't want to waste any of my willpower deciding what to wear or what to eat. Just put on the same gray suit every day. There was a blogger who explained this in more vivid terms, but let's say those of you familiar with American politics understand this is a problem we have. But anyway, we also looked at people who have personalities that have good self-control. Now, one obvious thing, if you have good self-control, you should be resisting desires more. So in that beeper study that we looked, did indeed the people who have scored higher on self-control, did they resist desires more? And no, it was statistically significant in the opposite direction. They were less likely to do it. Well, that kind of stumped us. How can that be? They also felt less guilty. Well, what it seemed to be is that they are making choices so they don't get themselves into those temptation situations. In the book, we call this playing offense rather than playing defense. You don't wait for the problem to arise and bail yourself out. Rather, you set yourself up, you set your life up so that you're not put in these difficult situations, not tempted to do things that will cause problems and stress later. Or to put this more pictorially, here's one of the classic images in Western civilization of self-control. There's Ulysses or Odysseus, depending whether you're Greek or Roman, on the ship coming home from the siege of Troy, and you know the story of the sirens. They sing this beautiful music, and the sailors wanted to hear it, so they steered close to shore to try to hear it better and crash on the rocks, and they sink. The ship sinks, and they all die. Well, Ulysses wants to hear the songs, but he doesn't want to crash the ship and die, so he has some very pre-commitment devices. You notice he's tied to the mast there. I don't know why dressing up in women's clothes is apparently supposed to help. The rowers all have their ears blocked up so they can't hear the music. But the thing is, people with good self-control took a different route home. Instead of using your willpower on the deck to fight this temptation, they just avoided the problem altogether. And that seems to be what people do. All right, I got to get going here. In terms of what we know about willpower in the brain, the brain evolved basically back to front. The back is the older wanting part, and the control parts are more in the front. But also, it's tied into a glucose, which is a chemical in the bloodstream that carries energy to your muscles and organs and to your brain too. So glucose is like brain fuel. And although the term has some meaning to sugar, it's not just from sugar. It's from anything that you eat that has nutrients in it. So we find that when people have low self-control, or have low glucose rather, their self-control is impaired and they do worse. Glucose is used for, again, it's the body's energy supply, so all these other things will affect your self-control. Physical exertion, you're tired after that, well, you're more likely to yield to temptation then because it's the same energy you used up in the physical exercise that you would need for self-control and for decision-making. Likewise, the immune system, when you're fighting an illness, you're more prone to make bad decisions and to have lapses in self-control because your body is pulling off a lot of the energy to fight the disease. At other times, the immune system doesn't need much, but when you're exposed to a cold or illness or something, then your body really wants all its energy. So I used to make myself keep working whenever I got sick. I'm just sitting at a computer. I'm not out carrying heavy rocks in the hot sun. But no, it turns out the best thing to do is just, you start to get sick, just go to bed and try to sleep for 36 hours, let your immune system do its work, and then get up and be better. Premenstrual syndrome also uses a lot of glucose there, but I don't have time to go into that today. I do want to talk about, on the glucose, so this will make the point very nicely. This is not my study. This is one of these things I wish I'd thought of. But some colleagues that got all the parole judge decisions for a couple years in Israel, and they went through them, mostly requests for parole. No parole. It's somebody's been in prison, thinks he's reformed and has behaved well and wants to get let out early to go back in society. The judge has to decide, is this person really better? Obviously, the judge really looks bad if you let the guy out and he goes and commits another crime. So the easy thing for the judge to do is just to say, no, send them all back to prison. But you know, some of these guys really have reformed and really deserve it. Well, they looked at what happens over the course of the day, and you know, each judge may make several dozen decisions. And they looked at the rate at which over each day the judge said yes or no. And you know, in principle, it should be linear. It should be the same decision frequency no matter what time of the day, the first or the last. But it looks, the general downward trend is that as the day wears on and the judge's willpower gets used up, then he's more likely to just go with the easy decision of throw the guy back in the slammer, whereas the early ones have a much better chance of being released. Now, there are two upticks there. Right about 10:30 in the morning, the judges get a break and they get a snack, a banana and a sandwich or something like that. And so the guys who come up right after that, they're lucky. They get they're more likely to get paroled again. And then it goes down further. If you come up for parole just before lunch, it's under 20% your chances of being released. Whereas the one right after lunch, it goes way up again to over half. So if you're ever, I hope this never happens to you, but if you're in prison then coming up before the parole judge and they say, well, we can take one more before lunch, would you like to go? Say no. You really want the judge's glucose to be all replenished when he hears your case. All right, last couple things in terms of what depletion feels like. Well, this is, London Times came up with this picture. I'm not sure this is exactly the idea. She is holding an apple there, which is not usually the first thing people notice in this photo. Anyway, given the importance of knowing when your willpower is down, it's important to be able to spot the signs in yourself. Unfortunately, there are not very many signs. There doesn't seem to be any strong signature feeling. And some other people have gone through all this, the published studies on this, which now there are a couple hundred. Yes, behavior changes very much when people are depleted. They do yield to temptation. They're more aggressive. They eat more, spend more money, all these things. But there's no feeling. When they combine all the results of how do you feel and so on, if anything, tiny effects that you would never notice, and mostly nothing. So depletion doesn't feel like anything. However, we have one series of studies that we found over and over again in which people seem to feel everything more strongly. So one sign that your willpower is depleted as things start to hit you more strongly. A number of people in our lab have even started using this as sort of advance warning when you're starting to get sick. If things bother you and upset you more than they should, that's sort of a sign that you don't have enough glucose to manage your emotions, probably because your immune system is cranking up to fight the disease. And so before you know you're getting sick, your body's already working to fight this, and it's taking away the energy that you would otherwise use for self-control, and things hit you harder. So in a sense, being depleted turns up the volume on life. And that's unfortunately the best nature has given us in terms of a subjective sign to know that our willpower is depleted and we're vulnerable to making bad decisions or yielding to temptation or doing things we'll be sorry about in the long run. Our top-down control of our own behavior is somewhat compromised. So, putting this in the last minute here, how to put this to work, you can get more out of yourself if you understand how willpower works. First of all, yes, it gets depleted, but you still have plenty. The body has great, extensive stores of glucose. Its natural inclination is to conserve them. We evolved in times when there might be no food for days at a time, and so the body is very protective of its energy. But the tank is not empty in modern civilization. You do still have willpower. Your body may be hesitating to use it, but it is there. There are mental tricks you can get yourself to do it, being in a position of power, reminding yourself of your responsibility, getting yourself to believe, even just reminding yourself that you have a lot more willpower than you might think that you do. That can enable you to continue performing well, even when you have already expended a fair amount of energy. You understand how to restore and recover from depletion. We find positive emotion and meditation and some things make people perform better. Of course, the real thing is to replenish the glucose, so getting a meal There's not as much evidence, but sleep seems to help significantly. So when they used to say, well, let's not face this decision now, we'll try it in the morning, just think, why, it's the same problem. You just will postpone it till morning, you're not getting anywhere. But on the contrary, if you get a good night's sleep and get some food in you, your body, your own batteries are recharged, and your willpower capacity is restored. People get up in the morning, they don't, they're in good shape. Also, use your willpower to establish habits to guide yourself. Don't use what they call the whack-a-mole strategy. I guess there's a game that plays where the mole pops up and you whack it down. Don't use it just to respond to crises. Use it to set up your life in a proactive way so that it will run smoothly, stay out of trouble, avoid the temptations rather than resisting them. Willpower can be increased by exercise, so set yourself little challenges and do them. Find small ways to improve yourself, even things just like start making your bed every day. These changes not only produce their own benefits, but also improve your capacity to change yourself and control yourself. And then ultimately understand when you're vulnerable, what sort of things happen, how these things go, understand how mind and body are related. In this way, indeed, you can make use of this great capacity, which I think does have a fair claim to be the greatest human strength. Thank you very much.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.